The morning mist hung over the ancient grounds of Windsor Castle as King Charles III adjusted his military dress uniform for what would become one of the most significant ceremonial events of his reign. The crisp October air carried the sound of marching feet from the parade grounds where British and Ukrainian troops had been preparing for weeks. This was no ordinary state visit. This was a moment that would be remembered in the annals of history, a powerful symbol of solidarity between two nations united in their commitment to democracy and freedom. Charles had risen before dawn, as was his custom when important state matters demanded his attention. The king's private secretary had briefed him extensively on the protocol for the day, but Charles understood that this ceremony transcended mere diplomatic formality. President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to Britain represented something far more profound than a standard state occasion. It was a testament to the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of conflict, a demonstration of Britain's unwavering support for Ukraine's fight for independence. In his private chambers, Charles reviewed the guest list one final time. Representatives from across the Commonwealth would be in attendance, along with senior military officials from NATO member states. The ceremony had been planned with meticulous attention to detail, every aspect designed to honor both the visiting Ukrainian delegation and the shared values that united the two nations. The king's military advisors had worked closely with their Ukrainian counterparts to ensure that the ceremony would properly reflect the courage and sacrifice of Ukrainian forces while maintaining the dignity and tradition expected of a royal occasion. The Ukrainian embassy in London had been buzzing with activity for days as preparations reached their final stages. Ambassador Vadim Prosteko had personally overseen many of the arrangements, ensuring that every detail met the high standards expected for such a momentous occasion. The embassy staff had worked tirelessly to coordinate with Buckingham Palace, the Foreign Office, and various military commands to create an event that would serve both ceremonial and diplomatic purposes. Across London, Ukrainian expatriates had been gathering since the early hours of the morning. Many had fled their homeland when the conflict began, finding refuge in Britain's welcoming embrace. For them, this ceremony represented more than just a diplomatic meeting between two leaders. It was validation of their struggle, recognition of their sacrifice, and hope for their nation's future. They lined the streets leading to Windsor Castle, waving both British and Ukrainian flags, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride and emotion. President Zelensky had arrived in London the previous evening, his security detail working in close coordination with Scotland Yard and the Royal Protection Squad. The Ukrainian leader had spent months on the international stage, traveling from capital to capital, building support for his nation's cause. But this visit to Britain held special significance. The British government had been among the first to provide substantial military aid to Ukraine, and the personal relationship between Zelensky and the British leadership had grown stronger with each passing month of conflict. The president's accommodation at Clarence House had been arranged with the utmost care for security and protocol. Every room had been swept multiple times by security teams, and the building itself had been transformed into a fortress of diplomatic immunity. Despite the heavy security presence, staff at Clarence House had worked to ensure that the Ukrainian delegation felt welcomed and honored during their stay. In the early hours of the ceremony day, Zelensky had spoken via video link with his commanders back in Ukraine. The contrast was stark and sobering. While he prepared for a ceremony celebrating international solidarity, his military leaders briefed him on the latest developments from the front lines. Cities continued to face bombardment, civilians remained in constant danger, and Ukrainian forces fought desperately to defend their homeland. The weight of this responsibility was never far from the president's mind, even as he participated in diplomatic ceremonies thousands of miles from the conflict. The British media had been covering the visit extensively, with news crews positioning themselves at strategic locations around Windsor Castle from the early morning hours. This was more than just another royal ceremony for the press corps. It represented a story that had captured the world's attention, a narrative of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, of democracy standing firm against authoritarianism. Veteran royal correspondents worked alongside international journalists, all seeking to capture the significance of this historic meeting. Security arrangements for the ceremony had required months of planning and coordination between multiple agencies. The threat assessment had been carefully evaluated, with particular attention paid to the international implications of bringing together such high-profile leaders during a time of active conflict. Counterterrorism units had swept the entire area repeatedly, while air defense systems provided an invisible but crucial protective umbrella over the proceedings. The choice of Windsor Castle as the venue had been deliberate and meaningful. The ancient fortress, with its thousand-year history of royal ceremony and state occasions, provided the perfect backdrop for an event that sought to emphasize the enduring nature of alliances and the timeless values of courage and honor. The castle's military heritage made it particularly appropriate for ceremony, focusing on troops and military cooperation. British military units had been preparing for weeks, with soldiers from the Household Division working alongside their Ukrainian counterparts to perfect the ceremonial drill. The integration of Ukrainian forces into the traditional British military ceremony required careful choreography and mutual respect for different traditions and customs. British drill sergeants had worked patiently with Ukrainian officers to ensure that the combined display would meet the exacting standards expected at a royal ceremony, while honoring the military traditions of both nations. The Ukrainian troops selected for the ceremony represented some of the finest soldiers in their nation's armed forces. Many had seen active combat, carrying with them the weight of real battle experience. Their presence at Windsor Castle served as a powerful reminder that this was not merely a ceremonial exercise, but a gathering of warriors who understood the true cost of freedom. These soldiers had volunteered for what they knew would be one of the most important assignments of their military careers. Weather forecasters had been monitoring conditions closely, and the morning promised to be clear and crisp, perfect for an outdoor ceremony. The autumn light would provide ideal conditions for the photographers and television crews who would document every moment of the historic gathering. The ground staff at Windsor Castle had worked tirelessly to ensure that every aspect of the venue was pristine, from the perfectly manicured lawns to the gleaming brass fittings on the ceremonial barriers. As the morning progressed, dignitaries began arriving at the castle in carefully orchestrated waves. Each arrival had been timed to perfection, ensuring that the ceremony would proceed without delay while maintaining the proper order of precedence expected at such events. Foreign ambassadors, military attaches, and government officials took their assigned positions, all aware that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after the last note of the ceremonial music had faded. The regimental bands had been rehearsing for weeks, learning both British military marches and Ukrainian national songs. Music directors had worked closely with their Ukrainian counterparts to select pieces that would honor both traditions while creating a cohesive ceremonial soundtrack. The emotional power of music to unite people across cultural and linguistic barriers would play a crucial role in the day's events. Behind the scenes, palace staff moved with practiced efficiency, ensuring that every detail was perfect. From the positioning of chairs to the timing of refreshments, nothing had been left to chance. The royal household understood that ceremonies of this magnitude required flawless execution, and their reputation for precision and attention to detail was on full display. King Charles had long understood the power of symbolism in international relations. His decades of experience as heir apparent had taught him that ceremonial events, when properly conceived and executed, could communicate messages far more powerful than any diplomatic communiqué. The ceremony being prepared would send a clear signal to the world about Britain's commitment to supporting democratic values and standing with allies in their darkest hours. The Ukrainian delegation included not only military personnel, but also representatives from various sectors of Ukrainian society. Artists, educators, and civic leaders have been invited to participate, reflecting the reality that the struggle for Ukrainian independence involved not just soldiers, but entire communities committed to preserving their way of life. Their presence at the ceremony would help illustrate that this was truly a conflict between two different visions of society and governance. As the final preparations were completed, a sense of anticipation filled the air at Windsor Castle. Staff members who had worked on countless royal ceremonies recognized that this event possessed a special significance that transcended normal diplomatic protocol. The convergence of historical tradition, contemporary politics, and human courage was creating something truly extraordinary. The grounds of Windsor Castle had been transformed into an open-air theater where the drama of international relations would play out against the backdrop of centuries of British history. The ancient stones of the castle walls seemed to watch over the proceedings, silent witnesses to yet another chapter in the long story of monarchy, democracy, and the eternal struggle between freedom and tyranny. Television crews from around the world had established their broadcasting positions, ready to carry the ceremony live to audiences across the globe. The technical complexity of coordinating international broadcasts while maintaining the dignity of the royal occasion required careful planning and execution. Producers understood that they were documenting not just a news event, but a moment of historical significance that would be studied and remembered for generations to come. The morning sun climbed higher in the clear October sky, casting long shadows across the castle grounds and illuminating the flags of Britain and Ukraine that flew side by side in the gentle breeze. The stage was set for an encounter between two leaders who represented not just their respective nations, but the broader struggle between democratic values and authoritarian aggression that was reshaping the modern world. In the final moments before the ceremony began, King Charles took a moment of private reflection in his chambers. He understood the weight of the moment, the historical significance of what was about to unfold. This was more than just another state occasion in a reign that would be filled with such events. This was an opportunity to demonstrate the enduring relevance of constitutional monarchy in supporting democratic values and international cooperation. President Zelensky, meanwhile, made final adjustments to his formal attire, understanding that every detail of his appearance would be scrutinized by cameras and commentators around the world. As a former actor and performer, he possessed an intuitive understanding of the theatrical elements inherent in such ceremonies. But he also carried the very real burden of representing a nation fighting for its survival. The time had come for the ceremony to begin, for two leaders to meet in circumstances that neither could have imagined when they first assumed their respective offices. The convergence of royal tradition and wartime leadership was about to create a moment that would resonate far beyond the ancient walls of Windsor Castle, sending a message of hope and solidarity to people around the world who believed in the power of democracy and the importance of standing together against tyranny. As the first notes of ceremonial music began to echo across the castle grounds, history prepared to record another chapter in the ongoing story of nations that choose to stand together in defense of freedom, regardless of the cost or consequences. The ceremony about to unfold would demonstrate that even in the darkest of times, the light of hope and solidarity could shine brightly enough to inspire courage in those who needed it most. The great doors of Windsor Castle swung open with ceremonial precision as King Charles III emerged into the autumn morning, his military decorations catching the bright sunlight. The king moved with the measured pace that had been drilled into him through decades of state occasions. Yet there was something different about this morning, an electricity in the air that spoke to the extraordinary nature of the gathering about to commence. Waiting in the courtyard stood President Volodymyr Zelensky, flanked by his security detail and senior Ukrainian officials. The contrast between the two leaders could not have been more striking, yet both men carried themselves with the dignity befitting their offices. Charles, resplendent in the full dress uniform of a British field marshal, represented centuries of royal tradition and constitutional monarchy. Zelensky, wearing the formal military-style clothing that had become his signature during the conflict, embodied the courage and determination of a nation fighting for its very existence. The moment their eyes met, both leaders understood the historical weight of the encounter. This was not merely a meeting between a constitutional monarch and an elected president, but a convergence of two different approaches to leadership united by shared democratic values and mutual respect. The photographers captured every gesture, every expression, knowing that these images would become part of the historical record of one of the most significant periods in European history. The formal greetings followed established protocol, yet observers noted the genuine warmth that passed between the two men. King Charles spoke first, welcoming President Zelensky to Britain with words that had been carefully chosen to convey both ceremonial courtesy and sincere solidarity. Zelensky responded in fluent English, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude for Britain's support while maintaining the dignity appropriate to the occasion. As they walked together toward the parade ground where the troops waited in formation, their conversation touched on subjects far removed from the ceremonial nature of the day. Zelensky briefed the king on the latest developments in his country, speaking with the matter-of-fact tone of a leader who had grown accustomed to delivering updates on matters of life and death. Charles listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated his genuine understanding of the complexities facing Ukraine. The parade ground at Windsor Castle had been transformed into an arena of international cooperation. British troops from the Household Division stood in perfect formation alongside Ukrainian soldiers who had traveled thousands of miles to participate in this ceremony. The sight was breathtaking in its symbolism, representing the practical reality of military cooperation between nations committed to defending democratic principles. General Sir Patrick Sanders, Chief of the General Staff, approached to brief both leaders on the order of ceremony. His presence underscored the serious military dimension of the gathering, reminding all present that beneath the pageantry lay the very real business of military alliance and mutual defense. The general's words were crisp and professional as he outlined how the review would proceed, his military bearing reflecting the seriousness with which the British armed forces viewed their relationship with their Ukrainian counterparts. The Ukrainian ambassador, Vadim Prosteko, stood nearby with other diplomatic officials, his face reflecting the pride and emotion that many felt at witnessing their nation being honored in such a distinguished setting. For Ukrainian diplomats who had spent months working tirelessly to build international support for their cause, this ceremony represented the tangible success of their efforts. The formal recognition implicit in the royal ceremony carried weight far beyond its ceremonial nature. As King Charles and President Zelensky took their positions for the formal review, the assembled troops came to attention with movements that had been practiced until they achieved mechanical perfection. The sound of hundreds of boots moving in unison echoed across the castle grounds, a rhythmic percussion that spoke to the discipline and training that transforms individual soldiers into cohesive military units. The regimental bands struck up the opening notes of the Ukrainian national anthem, and a profound silence fell over the gathering. For many of the Ukrainian personnel present, hearing their national song played in the historic setting of Windsor Castle carried an emotional impact that was difficult to express. Tears glistened in the eyes of seasoned soldiers as the familiar melody filled the air, carrying with it memories of home, family, and the cause for which they continued to fight. President Zelensky stood motionless during the playing of his national anthem, his bearing reflecting the solemnity of the moment. As a leader who had transformed from entertainer to wartime president, he understood better than most the power of symbols and ceremonies to inspire hope and maintain morale. The sound of the Ukrainian anthem being played with full military honors at one of Britain's most prestigious royal venues sent a clear message to the world about the international community's support for his nation. The British national anthem followed, its familiar strains adding to the ceremonial atmosphere while reinforcing the host nation's role in the proceedings. King Charles sang along quietly, his voice barely audible above the music, but his participation clearly visible to all present. For the monarch, this moment represented the continuation of his constitutional role in supporting Britain's foreign policy and international relationships. As the anthems concluded, the formal review began in earnest. King Charles and President Zelensky walked slowly along the lines of troops, stopping periodically to speak with individual soldiers. The conversations were brief but meaningful, with both leaders taking time to acknowledge the service and sacrifice represented by the men and women standing before them in perfect formation. When they reached the Ukrainian contingent, the emotion became palpable. These soldiers had volunteered for this ceremonial duty, knowing that their comrades continued to fight on the front lines back home. For them, participation in the Windsor Castle ceremony represented both honor and responsibility, an opportunity to represent their nation on the international stage while their country remained under attack. Colonel Andriy Kovalenko, the senior Ukrainian officer present, stepped forward to brief the reviewing leaders on his troops. His English was precise and formal as he outlined the units represented and their roles in the Ukrainian armed forces. Behind his professional demeanor lay months of combat experience and the weight of command responsibility in wartime conditions that few could truly understand. King Charles engaged each Ukrainian soldier in brief conversation, his questions demonstrating genuine interest in their experiences and service. The monarch's military training and experience allowed him to ask informed questions about their roles, equipment, and training. For soldiers accustomed to being viewed with suspicion or indifference by much of the world, the respectful attention of the British sovereign carried profound significance. President Zelensky moved among his troops with the easy familiarity of a leader who had earned genuine respect through shared hardship. His interactions were less formal than those of the king, reflecting his more direct leadership style and the realities of wartime command. Yet even in this relaxed atmosphere, the dignity of the occasion was maintained through the mutual respect evident between the president and his soldiers. The British troops presented arms as the reviewing party passed, their movements executing the drill with the precision expected of the household division. These were among Britain's finest soldiers, men and women who represented the highest standards of military professionalism and ceremonial expertise. Their participation in honoring the Ukrainian delegation reflected the official British position of support for Ukrainian independence and territorial integrity. Camera crews positioned around the parade ground captured every moment of the review, understanding that they were documenting a ceremony that would be studied and remembered for decades to come. The images being recorded would be used in news broadcasts around the world, serving to reinforce international awareness of the ongoing conflict and the importance of continued support for Ukraine. As the formal review continued, conversations between the two leaders touched on subjects ranging from military strategy to the humanitarian impact of the conflict. Zelensky shared insights into the resilience of his people, describing how communities had adapted to wartime conditions while maintaining their determination to preserve their independence. Charles listened with the engaged attention of someone who understood the broader implications of the struggle being described. The reviewing party paused at the position where representatives from various Commonwealth nations stood as observers. Their presence added an international dimension to the ceremony, reinforcing the global nature of the support network that had developed around Ukraine's struggle for independence. Each representative understood that they were witnessing a moment of historical significance that would influence international relations for years to come. Senior British military officials joined the reviewing party periodically, briefing both leaders on aspects of military cooperation and training programs. Lieutenant General Sir Rob Magowan outlined how British forces have been working with their Ukrainian counterparts, sharing expertise in areas ranging from urban warfare to advanced weapon systems. His briefing illustrated the practical dimension of the relationship being celebrated through ceremony. The Ukrainian military attaché, Colonel Maxim Zorin, provided updates on how British training and equipment had been integrated into Ukrainian forces. His account of battlefield effectiveness and operational improvements demonstrated the tangible benefits of international military cooperation. The technical details he shared were sobering reminders that behind the ceremonial pageantry lay the very real business of modern warfare. As they moved through different sections of the parade ground, King Charles and President Zelensky were joined by senior officials for both governments. Foreign Secretary James cleverly walked alongside Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, their conversation touching on diplomatic initiatives, and international legal efforts to support Ukraine's position in various international forums. The ceremony reached its climax as both leaders took their positions on the reviewing stand for the formal march past. The precision with which the troops executed their movements was a testament to weeks of preparation and the professional excellence of both military traditions. British and Ukrainian soldiers marched together, their synchronized movements symbolizing the unity of purpose that transcended national boundaries. The sight of Ukrainian and British flags being carried side by side in the march past provided one of the most powerful visual images of the entire ceremony. The flag bearers moved with solemn dignity, understanding that they carried not just pieces of colored cloth, but symbols of national identity and shared values that had brought their countries together in common cause. As the last unit completed the march past, King Charles and President Zelensky exchanged words of mutual appreciation and respect. Their conversation, though private, was clearly animated and sincere, reflecting the genuine bond that had developed between two leaders facing extraordinary circumstances. The ceremony had achieved its intended purpose of demonstrating solidarity and support while maintaining the dignity and tradition appropriate to such an occasion. The formal ceremonies at Windsor Castle continued as King Charles III and President Zelensky moved from the parade ground to the castle's historic St. George's Chapel for a private moment of reflection and remembrance. The ancient walls of the chapel, which had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies and state occasions, provided a sanctuary where both leaders could pause to honor those who had made the ultimate sacrifice in defense of freedom and democracy. Inside the chapel, representatives from military chaplain services of both nations had prepared a simple but moving ceremony of remembrance. The Ukrainian Orthodox priest, Father Andriy Zelensky, worked alongside the chapel royal's clergy to create a service that would honor fallen soldiers while respecting the religious traditions of both countries. Candles flickered in the ancient holders, casting dancing shadows on the medieval stonework and stained glass windows. King Charles and President Zelensky approached the memorial area where wreaths had been prepared for a laying ceremony. The silence in the chapel was profound, broken only by the distant sound of traffic outside the castle walls and the quiet footsteps of the small gathering of officials who had been permitted to witness this more intimate portion of the day's events. Both leaders understood the solemnity of the moment as they prepared to honor the memory of those who had died in service to their nations. The wreath prepared by the British delegation was crafted from flowers traditionally associated with remembrance, including poppies that served as the universal symbol of military sacrifice. The Ukrainian wreath incorporated sunflowers, their national flower, arranged alongside other blooms that held special significance in Ukrainian culture. The visual contrast between the different floral traditions served to emphasize the distinct cultural heritage that each nation brought to their alliance. President Zelensky stepped forward first, his movements deliberate and respectful as he placed his nation's wreath at the base of the memorial. His face reflected the weight of personal loss that came with wartime leadership, the knowledge that every strategic decision carried with it the potential for casualties among the forces under his command. For a leader who had transformed from civilian to wartime commander, moments like these carried profound personal significance. King Charles followed, laying the British wreath with the practiced solemnity of someone who had participated in countless ceremonies of remembrance throughout his long public life. Yet observers noted something different in his demeanor, a heightened awareness of the contemporary relevance of the ancient rituals being performed. This was not merely another ceremonial duty, but a moment of genuine tribute to ongoing sacrifice and courage. Father Zelensky offered prayers in Ukrainian, his words carrying across the chapel's vaulted spaces with an emotional intensity that transcended language barriers. Even those who could not understand the specific words could feel the power of his invocation, the way his voice carried the pain and hope of a people struggling to maintain their independence. The British chaplain responded with prayers in English, creating a dialogue of faith that bridged cultural and linguistic differences. After the religious observances, Both leaders spent several minutes in silent reflection. The chapel's acoustics amplified even the smallest sounds, making their shared silence seem to echo through the ancient space. During these quiet moments, each man was alone with his thoughts about the responsibilities of leadership and the human cost of the conflicts that had brought them together. When they emerged from the chapel, the atmosphere outside had shifted noticeably. Word of the ceremony had spread beyond the castle grounds, and larger crowds had gathered along the roads leading to Windsor. British citizens, many of Ukrainian heritage, had come to show their support and solidarity. Their presence added a spontaneous democratic element to what had begun as a formal state occasion. The planned route back to the main castle building took both leaders through areas where they could interact with some of the gathered spectators. Security protocols had been adjusted to allow for limited public engagement, understanding that the human dimension of the visit was as important as its formal diplomatic aspects. King Charles moved easily among the crowds, his decades of public engagement serving him well in this unscripted portion of the day. President Zelensky's interaction with the Ukrainian expatriate community was particularly moving. Many of those gathered had fled their homeland when the conflict began, carrying with them only what they could manage in a few suitcases. For them, seeing their president being honored by the British royal family represented validation of their struggle and hope for their eventual return home. Conversations were conducted in rapid Ukrainian, with translations provided for British officials who accompanied the group. Among the crowd stood Maria Petrovna, an elderly Ukrainian woman who had arrived in Britain just months earlier after her home in Mariupol had been destroyed. She clutched a small Ukrainian flag and wept openly as President Zelensky approached her. Their brief conversation, conducted in their native language, was too quiet for most observers to hear, but the emotional impact was visible to all present. Such moments transformed the formal diplomatic occasion into something far more personal and human. British military families were also present among the spectators, many wearing regimental ties or other insignia that identified their connection to the armed forces. For them, the ceremony represented the broader alliance relationships that their loved ones might be called upon to support. The presence of serving soldiers' families added weight to the proceedings, reminding all present that military cooperation involved real people with real stakes in international relationships. As they continued toward the castle, King Charles and President Zelensky were joined by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and other senior government officials who had arrived for the next phase of the day's events. The Prime Minister's participation emphasized the governmental dimension of British support for Ukraine, complementing the constitutional monarchy's role in the ceremonial aspects of international relations. Inside the castle state apartments, a more intimate gathering had been arranged for senior officials from both countries to engage in substantive discussions about ongoing cooperation and future planning. The setting was the castle's Waterloo Chamber, chosen deliberately for its historical associations with previous European conflicts and the complex alliances that had shaped continental history. Defense Secretary Ben Wallace briefed the gathering on current British military assistance programs, outlining both the equipment that had already been delivered and the training programs that were helping to build Ukrainian military capabilities. His presentation included classified information that demonstrated the scope and sophistication of the cooperation that had developed between the two military establishments. Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov responded with his own assessment of how British assistance had been integrated into Ukrainian operations. His account was necessarily general due to operational security concerns, but it clearly illustrated the effectiveness of the partnership that had been forged under the pressure of actual combat conditions. The technical discussion that followed demonstrated the professional military relationship that had developed beyond the ceremonial aspects of the day. Intelligence officials from both countries provided briefings on the broader strategic situation, sharing assessments that would inform future policy decisions. The classified nature of much of this discussion meant that only a limited number of officials could participate, but the information exchanged would influence decision-making processes for months to come. The combination of formal ceremony and practical planning illustrated how modern diplomatic relationships operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Queen Consort Camilla joined the gathering for portions of the discussion that focused on humanitarian assistance and civilian support programs. Her involvement emphasized the broader societal dimension of the relationship between Britain and Ukraine, extending beyond military cooperation to include aid for refugees, medical assistance, and educational exchanges that would help rebuild Ukrainian society when the conflict ended. The conversation turned to longer-term planning as both sides discussed what post-conflict reconstruction might require. Ukrainian officials outlined their vision for rebuilding democratic institutions and civil society, while British counterparts offered insights from their own experiences with post-conflict recovery and institutional development. These discussions, while necessarily speculative, helped establish frameworks for future cooperation. Cultural attaches from both countries presented reports on exchanges that had been developed to preserve and promote Ukrainian culture during the conflict. British museums and cultural institutions had provided safe storage for Ukrainian artifacts, while Ukrainian artists and writers had found refuge and support in British institutions. These programs represented the softer dimension of international solidarity that complemented military and diplomatic cooperation. As the afternoon progressed, attention turned to public diplomacy and media strategy. Officials from both countries coordinated their messaging to ensure that the day's events would be properly communicated to international audiences. The ceremony's symbolic value needed to be translated into practical political support, both in Britain and among other potential allies who might be influenced by the demonstration of Anglo-Ukrainian cooperation. Economic advisors briefed both leaders on trade relationships and reconstruction planning. Despite the ongoing conflict, work was already beginning on frameworks that would govern economic cooperation once hostilities ended. British businesses had expressed interest in participating in Ukrainian reconstruction efforts, while Ukrainian officials were eager to establish the legal and regulatory frameworks that would facilitate international investment. The technical complexity of modern international relationships was evident in a range of specialists who participated in various aspects of the day's discussions. From cybersecurity experts who coordinated on digital threats to agricultural specialists working on food security issues, the partnership between Britain and Ukraine encompassed virtually every aspect of governmental activity. Parliamentary representatives from both countries met separately to discuss legislative initiatives that could formalize and extend various aspects of the cooperation that had developed. The democratic dimension of the relationship was emphasized through these discussions, highlighting how elected representatives in both countries supported the alliance that their executives had forged. As the formal discussions concluded, both leaders reflected on how the day's events had accomplished their intended objectives. The ceremony had successfully demonstrated British support for Ukraine while maintaining the dignity and tradition expected of royal occasions. The substantive discussions that accompanied the ceremonial elements had advanced practical cooperation and planning in ways that would have lasting impact beyond the immediate publicity value of the royal meeting. As evening approached at Windsor Castle, the final phase of the historic ceremonial day began with preparations for a state banquet that would bring together dignitaries from across the international community. The castle's magnificent St. George's Hall had been transformed into a glittering venue that showcased both British royal tradition and contemporary diplomatic hospitality. Crystal chandeliers cast brilliant light across tables set with the finest royal china and silverware, creating an atmosphere of elegance that befitted the significance of the occasion. King Charles III and President Zelensky met privately in the castle's Oak Room before joining their guests for the evening's festivities. This final private conversation allowed both leaders to reflect on the day's events and discuss the longer-term implications of the partnership that had been so publicly demonstrated. Their discussion touched on subjects ranging from immediate military needs to the broader vision of European security architecture that might emerge from the current crisis. The guest list for the state banquet read like a directory of international leadership and influence, Ambassadors from NATO countries were joined by representatives from neutral nations who had chosen to support Ukrainian resistance through humanitarian assistance and diplomatic pressure. The presence of such a diverse group of international figures underscored the global nature of the support network that had developed around Ukraine's struggle for independence. Queen Consort Camilla welcomed guests in the reception area, her conversations with Ukrainian cultural figures highlighting the personal dimension of the relationship that had developed between the royal family and Ukrainian society. She spoke at length with Oksana Alinev, the renowned Ukrainian conductor, discussing how British cultural institutions had provided platforms for Ukrainian artists to continue their work despite the disruption of war. The Prince and Princess of Wales arrived with their own delegation of younger diplomatic and cultural figures representing the next generation of leadership in both countries. Their presence emphasized the long-term nature of the relationship being celebrated, suggesting that the bonds forged during this crisis would continue to influence Anglo-Ukrainian relations for decades to come. Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby offered an opening blessing that acknowledged the spiritual dimension of the struggle being supported through the day's ceremonies. His words, carefully chosen to respect the religious diversity of the gathering while recognizing the moral dimension of the conflict, provided a framework for understanding the deeper significance of international solidarity in the face of aggression. President Zelensky's address to the gathering was perhaps the most anticipated moment of the entire day. Speaking without notes, he delivered a presentation that combined personal reflection with strategic analysis, describing how the support of allies like Britain had not only provided practical military assistance, but had also sustained the morale of his people during their darkest hours. His words carried the authenticity that came from first-hand experience of wartime leadership. The president spoke movingly about the transformation of his own role from entertainer to wartime commander, acknowledging the irony of finding himself addressing the British royal family in circumstances he could never have imagined when he first entered political life. His self-deprecating humor about this transformation drew warm laughter from the assembled guests, while emphasizing the extraordinary nature of the times they were all living through. King Charles responded with his own address that placed the day's events within the broader context of British constitutional monarchy and its role in supporting democratic values worldwide. He spoke about the evolution of royal ceremonial functions to address contemporary challenges while maintaining connections to historical traditions that had sustained British society through previous crises. His words demonstrated the careful balance required in modern constitutional monarchy between tradition and contemporary relevance. The monarch's speech included specific recognition of the Ukrainian soldiers who had participated in the day's ceremonies, acknowledging their courage in representing their nation while their comrades continued to fight on the front lines. This personal recognition from the sovereign carried special weight in the context of British military tradition and the importance placed on royal acknowledgement of military service. During the banquet itself, conversations at individual tables reflected the diverse international perspectives that had been brought together for the occasion. At one table, NATO military commanders discussed interoperability challenges with their Ukrainian counterparts, sharing technical insights that would inform future cooperation programs. At another, humanitarian organizations coordinated with government officials on refugee assistance and civilian protection initiatives. Ukrainian Ambassador Vadim Prystaiko found himself in animated discussion with former British prime ministers who had gathered to show their support for the occasion. The multi-party nature of British support for Ukraine was demonstrated through the presence of political figures from across the spectrum, all united in their conviction that democratic values required active defense when threatened by authoritarian aggression. The cultural program that accompanied the banquet featured performances that highlighted both British and Ukrainian artistic traditions. The Royal Philharmonic Orchestra performed pieces by British composers alongside works by Ukrainian masters, creating a musical dialogue that transcended political boundaries. The emotional impact of hearing Ukrainian compositions performed in the magnificent acoustics of St. George's Hall provided one of the evening's most moving moments. Young Ukrainian refugees who had found shelter in Britain were invited to share their experiences with the gathered dignitaries. Their testimonies, delivered with remarkable composure despite their youth, provided stark reminders of the human cost of the conflict that had brought everyone together. The contrast between their experiences of displacement and trauma and the elegant surroundings of the royal banquet emphasized the moral urgency that motivated international support efforts. British military families affected by deployment to training and support missions related to Ukraine shared their own perspectives on the conflict's impact. Their presence at the banquet demonstrated the democratic principle that military commitments required societal support and understanding. The conversations between military families and Ukrainian officials helped bridge the gap between policy decisions and their human consequences. Media representatives covering the banquet noted the careful choreography that ensured maximum positive coverage while maintaining the dignity appropriate to the venue and occasion. The royal household's expertise in managing high-profile events was evident in every detail, from the positioning of cameras to the timing of speeches that would accommodate international broadcast schedules. As the formal portion of the evening concluded, smaller groups formed for more intimate conversations that would continue late into the night. These informal discussions often proved more valuable than formal meetings in advancing understanding and cooperation between different nations and organizations. The relaxed atmosphere of the post-banquet period allowed for the kind of personal connections that often proved crucial in international relations. Security arrangements for the evening required careful coordination between multiple agencies, given the concentration of high-value targets in a single location. The successful execution of these arrangements, invisible to most guests but crucial to the evening's success, demonstrated the professional competence of British security services and their Ukrainian counterparts working in partnership. The evening's events were broadcast live to audiences around the world, with particular attention paid to Ukrainian communities in diaspora who had been following the day's proceedings with intense interest. For many Ukrainian expatriates, seeing their president being honored at the highest levels of British society provided emotional validation of their struggle and hope for their nation's future. Social media coverage of the banquet extended the reach of the day's message far beyond the immediate audience present at Windsor Castle. Images and video clips from the evening would be shared millions of times, creating a global conversation about international solidarity and the importance of supporting democratic values. The viral nature of modern communications transformed a traditional diplomatic event into a worldwide demonstration of unity. As guests began to depart in the late evening hours, both King Charles and President Zelensky expressed satisfaction with how the day's events had exceeded expectations in demonstrating international solidarity and practical cooperation. Their final conversation of the day, conducted in the relative privacy of the castle's departure areas, allowed for candid assessment of what had been accomplished and what challenges remained ahead. The Ukrainian delegation's departure from Windsor Castle marked the end of a day that had successfully combined ceremonial tradition with contemporary diplomatic necessity. The images and memories created during the visit would continue to influence international opinion and policy long after the last guest had departed and the castle had returned to its normal routines. President Zelensky's final words to the gathered media emphasized his gratitude not only for the formal support demonstrated through the day's ceremonies, but for the human warmth and genuine friendship he had experienced from the British royal family and government officials. His comments reflected the personal dimension of international relations that often proved as important as formal treaties and agreements. King Charles, in his own departing remarks, emphasized that the day's events represented not an end, but a beginning of expanded cooperation between Britain and Ukraine. He spoke about the ongoing nature of the commitment that had been demonstrated through ceremony, making clear that the support symbolized by royal recognition would continue regardless of how long the current crisis persisted. The success of the day's events was measured not only in immediate media coverage, but in the practical advancement of relationships that would support Ukraine through the continuing challenges ahead. Agreements reached during the day's meetings would translate into concrete assistance programs, While the symbolic power of royal recognition would continue to influence international opinion in favor of Ukrainian independence and territorial integrity. As Windsor Castle settled into quiet after the departure of the last guests, the ancient walls seemed to hold the memory of another historic day in their long chronicle of significant events. The convergence of royal tradition and contemporary crisis had created a moment that would be remembered as a crucial demonstration of how democratic nations could unite in support of shared values when those values faced existential threat. The day's events had demonstrated that ceremonial monarchy, far from being merely decorative, could play a vital role in modern international relations by providing platforms for demonstration of solidarity that transcended normal diplomatic channels. The combination of pageantry and substance had created a form of soft power that would continue to influence global opinion long after the immediate crisis had passed. The legacy of King Charles and President Zelensky's meeting at Windsor Castle would extend far beyond the immediate circumstances that had brought them together. The precedent established for royal recognition of democratic resistance to authoritarian aggression would influence how future crises were addressed, while the practical cooperation agreements reached during the visit would serve as models for international assistance programs in other conflict situations. As the final reports were filed and the last photographs uploaded to news services around the world, the full impact of the day's events began to emerge. What had begun as a ceremonial visit had evolved into a comprehensive demonstration of how nations could support each other through the combination of symbolic recognition, practical assistance, and personal solidarity that transcended formal diplomatic protocols.